Hello everyone, hope you're all doing great. Thank you again for all the kind comments on my last video and on my Instagram. I wanted to say, remember, if you struggle with mental health problems, make sure that you have a good structure in your life. It doesn't sound like much, but it's extremely important for me to stay good and to get everything done and not worry as much. It hasn't got to be the most overstructured thing in the world or too complicated. But just make sure that you have some kind of routine, like it'll really do a lot of good for your head, honestly. The worst I get is when I don't have goals or structure, but having them simple things can make the world's difference, so just remember that. I hope you enjoy these stories, I love you, and I'll talk to you all soon. And make sure you check out the podcast below, and my Instagram, which is at Joe the Insomniac. So I live in a somewhat medium-sized town, with a mix of cities and backwoods areas. A bus stop I usually use is a good mix. It has buildings close by, while also having entryways into the nearby surrounding buildings. One morning, I was waiting in the middle of nowhere for the bus. I realise how late it is in the morning. I get annoyed and decide, since I was bored, I would go into this little walkway/trail that's nearby. Not all the way, just enough to where I could be secluded by the trees. After a while of checking my phone, I hear the bus stopping a little way from me. I head back to see if it's there, and I get a fight or flight response that was very intense. It's like a gunshot. I turn around to see this crouching creature coming out of the secluded area that I was in. It was pitch black. Its arms were about the size of its body. Its head looked like it was an eraser that's used. The most terrifying part of the creature is its size. It's easily the size of a telephone pole. It towered over me, and everything around it. Its hands were large and its fingers were thick, and were about half the size of my arm. I don't know if I should run because I know this thing could catch me easily. Some time passed while it climbed out of the walkway and just stood looking at me. Then the bus pulled up, opens its doors. I look at the bus and back to the creature, but I can't see it now. I look at the bus driver and his face is normal, so I assume that he hasn't seen it. I got on the bus and cried silently for a good 5 minutes. I don't know if this correlated or if it's just my brain, but that night, I had a dream with the exact same thing that happened to me, except the bus doesn't show up and my limbs get ripped off. My friends don't believe me about it. I don't know whether I saw a skinwalker or what, but I hate the fact that the bus driver didn't see it too. I have no idea what it was to this day, and I still get very scared if I go back to that bus stop or I'm near the forest line where this thing come from. I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington near Mount Rainier. Like, not an official campground, just way out in the forest where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night, I wake up and hear something. I open my tent and there's a guy sitting by where I am with my fire and right beside the tent. Nothing in particular is noteworthy about the situation now or the guy. It's just a regular guy sitting outside where I am, a couple of feet away from my tent. But he's got no pack or anything with him, just a guy there. He saw me open the tent. His eyes got huge, like he just saw a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day, I managed to put it out of my mind fairly well after writing it off as just some odd occurrence, and somebody probably off his head or something. And maybe it's a coincidence he's near me and he got lost going back to his campsite. Then, 2 days after that, and 10 to 15 miles away in totally random directions that nobody could take the same path as on accident, I was sitting by the fire that night and started hearing noises that got more and more convincing that a person's there. I call out to them, and out of the darkness someone was like, "Do you know how to get the bell crown?" I said no. I didn't even think it was a real thing. They kept talking just out of my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, but they yelled, "Aim that away," and that kind of spooks me. After like 15 minutes of being very freaked out, and them talking and asking completely random questions from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer, so I shined my light again, and it was the same dude who'd been outside the night before. He had to have followed me for almost 15 miles in 2 days, this means. It's not an accident. No way, it's impossible. And as soon as my light hits him, he takes off again. I start to chase him, but didn't want to get lost in the wilderness in the darkness, so stopped quickly after probably 100 or 200 feet. This one couldn't be written off now, because the only way he could have been in both places is specifically if he was following. I decided the trip was very, very unsettling and hike back over the next 3 days, constantly doubling back, trying to throw off anybody from following me. I occasionally hide and see if anyone's there. I really can't describe how terrifying it was to feel like I'm being hunted through the woods, and to actually have to brainstorm on things I could do best to avoid potentially being murdered on. On the first night of hiking out, twice I heard what sounded like a person walking circles outside my tent, but by the time I mustered the courage to look, no one's there. On the second night, I heard what I thought was an animal making noises in the distance, but slowly decided that it sounds more human. It could have been somebody pretending to be an animal though, but it really sounded like a person making howling noises. I almost cried when I finally got back to the car, because the feeling of relief was so strong. To this day, I have literally no idea who this person is or why they were following me, and I don't understand how they were surviving fine without any backpack or tent. That's what scares me the most. They must have been out there for a while. I hate to think what would have happened if I fell asleep with them around. I live in a small town in Kentucky, and I've lived there for my entire life, and because of that, I've been surrounded by the mountains and woods for years. My house is currently nestled into the woods in the middle of nowhere, and thus, outdoor activities has taken up a massive chunk of my life, especially in the summer and fall. I'm in the woods almost daily, hiking to the creeks to fish or meadows to hunt. I know the woods and trails around my home like the back of my hand. That said, there is definitely something that calls to you while you're out in the woods, especially when you're alone, and I've just realised now that after stumbling upon these subs that it's something I probably shouldn't have brushed off, but it's hard to ignore. My parents began allowing me to hike alone when I was around 13, but I didn't get really into it until about 2 years later when I'm 15. Even then though, I wasn't allowed to go far and always had a walkie-talkie. Later at 17, I'm allowed to have a handgun with me, but that's neither here nor there. There's stories I can tell at that age too, but this one happened when I was 15. Before I get into it, I should mention that I have 2 dogs outside, Max a black lab and Bo a beagle. I've had both since I was young, and they're smart, always staying by my side when I'm in the woods. They always listen to me, until this day. I'm hiking a trail that runs up beyond my aunt's house, one that I'd hike in and out of during the day. Now I just get out to enjoy the woods there really. It was in October, so the weather was cool and hot, and I'd been hiking for about an hour. The trail comes out on a spring that runs down from the top of this particular mountain. It hadn't rained that day, so the spring was mostly dry and covered in leaves. I remember looking up the mountains, which I'd never liked to hike to the top of before, but I had this strange call. It wasn't really a voice, but an urge that I can't ignore. Keep in mind that I'm a very timid person, and hiking unfamiliar trails on my own freaks me out to this day. But that day, all my fear had dissipated. I begin hiking higher and higher. My dogs are following. I don't even know how to describe the feeling that came over me, but I just remembered staring down at my feet and feeling at peace as I climbed. There's a moment when I stopped to look out at the houses below. I'd never been so high up. Remember, I felt amazed. I took a picture on my phone, and then I look around me for my dogs. Both had already run off and Max was following. I called out to them frantically to stop, but they don't listen. They disappear. At this point, looking down at the mountainside, I'm very afraid. Then I look back uphill, and it came over me again. I keep hiking. I can't stop. Eventually, I heard my walkie-talkie crackle. Everything was distorted, and I couldn't make out any words. I assume now I was just out of range to pick it up. But back then, it freaks me out. Whatever come over me had now stopped. My dogs were still gone. Panicked, I began running downhill. It's a wonder I don't get hurt. As I near the wide section of the spring near the bottom, my walkie-talkie picks back up, and I heard my dogs running downhill behind me. I gone home, and mostly forgotten about it. I just told myself that I'd been lost and to be more careful. Now fast forward many years to now. I still hike. I commented a short version of this before, but saying I'd add more, and there is more. So last year, I hike up to a cave behind my house. This is something that I've done a million times before, and then I started following a trail that I'd never fully explored, just out of curiosity. Bo was ahead of me as per usual, but when I call back to her, she comes. We hiked for the better part of 45 minutes, following a pretty simple trail, and then I figured out I'd better be heading back because it'd be getting dark soon. And yet I couldn't stop. I kept telling myself I'd go for a little bit further and a bit more. I remembered looking down at my feet, just like before, and listening to the silence of the woods around me, and feeling at peace. It felt so easy just to go deeper, and so difficult to turn around. Bo felt the call too, because even after that, I did break out of it and turn around. And then called her back, and she wouldn't stop. I had to catch up with her and physically turn her around and pet her before she'd come with me. Now these stories really worried me. What if I didn't stumble? What if my mum hadn't decided to contact me at that moment? How deep would I have hiked, and what would have waited for me in the depths? I don't know what's out there, but I do know this. The woods definitely called me. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time we could manage it. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning, and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved to pretend that we were frontiermen. We built shelters, traps, practiced making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was actually based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little way off the track. Of course we knew this was dangerous and we'd likely be trespassing, but we're kids. We had a lot of fun. We'd find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges that nobody went on. We fished, hid from trains. At night, we camped in the woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. I loved doing this. It was so fun we do it multiple times and never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went on our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits so we'd see each other occasionally. But one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We'd do stuff with family in the day, and at night, we'd either catch drinks at the bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe were talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are a hell of a mix, so we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night and walk home. The day came. We started out early morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot where we used to start, right outside of our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention that to us. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we'd go the opposite way, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well, we had a map, so I gave a what the hell and we set off. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but all in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoking, and then moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. Before the night set in, we picked a spot to camp in. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the track, so you felt like you're in a tunnel. We had brought the small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting on the perimeter. Now, this is what we used to do in the old days too. We'd walk the area, go around a little, and make sure some dude's house wasn't just over the hill, and we're not just on their yard. We'd walk maybe 100 feet or so into the woods, up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from the top of the short hill, we'd be okay. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods, just barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed that it was a sugar shack or something, but there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in there either. All was quiet, no movement could be seen, no lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly. As we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all, instead an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building, and the wooden planks are almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on the top of the place, also weathered black. None of the windows had glass, and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside. There were rows of pews and a build-up section in the front the preacher would stand on. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there were no signs of anybody else. No footprints, no paths, no roads. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to our spot that we had picked to camp at. Having a hill between us, we felt a lot safer, but we're still on edge. We chalk it up to the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods. Besides, at this point, it was dusk and we decided to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep and move on early morning. Night set in. As we lay in our hammocks, we start talking, and we begin to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. "You hear that? What the hell? It sounds like someone singing." And at this point, we both slid right out of our hammocks, hunkered down, starting to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we moved back up the hill to spy from where they are. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. The moon was barely out, but provided enough light for us to walk there. We don't use flashlights because obviously we don't want to be seen. It's coming from the church and the singing's coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and heard a conversation. It sounded like they were talking in tongues almost. The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickers, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung exactly. It sounded like church music, but another version in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We have no intention of getting closer either. We're about a football field length away now. The singing continued and then stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared the life out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you'd see in movies, but they were speaking a different language and we can't get a word of it. Eventually it got to where the male single voice would say something, then another lot would answer in song. This lasted for a while, then they all broke out into this long sustained wail that just kept getting louder, and it's so disturbing. At this point, I was getting ready to say, let's get out of there, but Joe says, hey, they're coming. And we get far enough away that we couldn't really make them out well, but what we could see was a line of people seemingly coming straight towards us, still singing. We book it down the hill to our campsite, grab our stuff and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction we come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them is shaking. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we can, eventually seeing the lights and the end of the road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down it. As we walk there, we get to a 24-hour gas station and call my wife to get us. My wife and other friends all just think it's kids messing around, but we sure as hell know there weren't kids singing like that. We're not sure who those people were, but it's definitely the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me. When I was 19, I used to love going for early morning runs alone in the woods outside my college campus. I never saw another person on my trail, and I really enjoyed the silence in the early morning. However, one day, I was feeling unwell and decided to stop about halfway in. I was relatively close to the outskirts of the woods. I kneel over and got sick. I then hear snapping and crunching behind me and turn and see a guy running right towards me in all black, seemingly out of nowhere. He's definitely not out for an early morning jog like me. I can't describe the feeling of dread that washed over me as he silently quickens his pace towards me. I pulled myself together and ran out there as fast as possible. I ran my first and only 6-minute mile that day and never went to go in them woods again. This happened to my roommate and I 2 years ago, when we drove into the national forest just outside of the town I lived in. We go to a small college in New England, about 3 hours away from any major city. For context, this forest had quite a few urban legends surrounding it, and the local community, although they'd go there often, having a lot of superstitions about being safe there and what you need to do. I just broke up with my partner and my roommate could sense I'm down. Finals are around the corner, so she decides to help me get out of my mind and suggests we go to a few spots there that she's found and just chill and de-stress. We took a couple of beers with us and drove to this secluded spot in the forest. From the moment we left the main asphalt road into the forest, I saw a couple of things that unsettled me. You could see the abandoned houses of a ghost town from the higher ground that the road is on, and we saw this old doll hanging from a rope on a tree. Creepy, but we didn't really give it a second thought and kept driving. We got to a clearing and parked our car behind some trees, popped open the back of our SUV, and started just talking, playing music. About 10 minutes into this, 2 cars appeared on the road and parked in the clearing. My friend doesn't pay attention to them. Instead, she keeps talking, but I was facing them from where I sat, and I couldn't stop seeing what they did. A guy popped out of the car, another does too, and they talk. And then I saw them take out a long object covering dark plastic bags from the back of the car. This is when I noticed one of them has a gun, not like a shotgun either. They then start lighting the bag on fire. I told my friend to get down. She turned around and saw them for the first time, black smoke rising from the bags, and between them, trying to keep my head down and steal glances as I saw them take out another object. I heard them shoot at it before they set it on fire. I don't know how long my friend and I were laying there in silence, but definitely long enough to let the terror sink in. At this point, I look up and saw they're pointing at our car and they start walking into the woods, maybe trying to follow our tracks or find us. All I know is that right then, I told my friend jump into the driver's seat and we gotta make a run for it. I shut the back door between that and the car starting up. The guys hear this and actually start sprinting towards us. We went over a hill and drive as far as we can to try and get safe, then into the neighbouring town and roamed around for a while, just making sure we're not being followed. That day, we tried to make fun of the whole situation and got drunk, but started crying because we saw something we shouldn't have, and we were in grave danger.